Hello, learners. Welcome back to the course on social processes and behavioral issues. We today are in Unit 11, Session 2 of the course, and once again, we continue with perception where we had finished in the previous session. Now, today's topic is equally interesting, and this topic will be on the fundamentals of social perception. So, when we look at perception, we are not looking at perception on its own, but we rather are looking at social perception. Now, so what is social perception and what are the typical errors and biases that one normally associates with the process of social perception? Okay. So today, to be specific, what shall we be looking at? We'll be looking at social perception, the perceptual biases, and the organizational influences. Now, moving ahead, what is the nature of social perception? Social perception is the process of combining, integrating, and interpreting information about others to gather an accurate understanding about them. Basically, when we are looking at organizational behavior, our focus is on social perception only. So, when we look at people around us, how do we perceive them and how do we judge them? And what are those processes which help making this entire effort possible? That is what our focus is. And that, in short, is what social perception is. So, what is it? It's the process of combining, integrating, and interpreting information about others to gain an accurate understanding about them. Now, there are certain factors which influence the process of social perception, and the first is the characteristics of the perceiver or the person who is making the perception. Now, there are certain important elements here. What are they? The first is how best do you know yourself? When we are negative, we perceive the world around us in a negative way. If we are buoyant, we are positive, we can perceive the world around us in a positive manner. So that's why one's own characteristics affect the perception of others. People who accept themselves will be less critical while viewing others. And accuracy in perception is not a single scale. Now, apart from characteristics of the perceiver, characteristics of the perceived also will matter when perception or social perception is talked about. The first is the status. What is the status of the person who you are perceiving? Is it a parent? Is it a teacher? Is it a mentor? Is it a guru? Is it a boss? Is it a leader? So how do you see the person from that status? Then what is the role of the person in your life? And the visible traits which are there. Now, very often, we are able to gauge that a person is short-tempered because there are certain traits that you see on a repeated basis. So these can be certain reasons or certain factors which may influence the way you are perceiving the perceived. Okay. So basically, if I'm looking at social perception, there are two factors which may impact. One is characteristics of the perceiver, and the other is the characteristics of the perceived. Now, moving ahead, social perception is full of perceptual biases and errors. As it is said, that it is not very easy on our part to gain an accurate understanding of a person or to make a proper judgment or proper perception about a particular situation. There can be many flaws, many errors in it. And as learners of organization behavior, I think we should be aware of what these biases and errors are. Now, the first and the most common is called as stereotyping. Stereotyping is a very common word which is used in the OV dictionary and in everyday language. So, what does it mean? It refers to the tendency to perceive another person as belonging to a single class or category. Now, very often we are lazy people. We don't want to make or waste our time forming judgments about every individual who we come across. So, in order to make that shortcut possible, that how do we quickly make judgments about a person within the limited time that we have? What do? We put that person in a particular category or a class. And based on the characteristics of that category or that class, we form some kind of a judgment about the person. Now, stereotyping was researched by Walter Lippmann in 1922, who applied the word to perception. Now, what are the commonly stereotyped groups? They include managers, supervisors, knowledge workers, young people, old people, minorities, etc. Now, to give you some examples, very often we today talk of Gen Z in a very different tone that, oh, Gen Z is this, upcoming young generation, which is so different from the generations that have preceded it. So, when we look at young people today, we say that, oh, this is, they are hooked 24 into 7 on the internet because they are all products of Gen Z. We don't bother to make judgments of individuals, but rather we make judgment of the group we think that the person belongs to. Now, there is another stereotype that is very commonly prevalent in the society and in organizations, and that is based on gender. So, if I'm a woman, there are certain attributes that I need to have because that is my stereotype that, I will occupy the role of a mother, I occupy the role of a sister, wife, etc. And that is how I will work. Now, even in an organization, sometimes these stereotypes play out. And, very often we see that people make their choices or base their choices on the kind of stereotypes that are normally ascribed. So, many women take a mid career break after having a child, maybe because that is expected of them, or maybe because, balancing the job of a mother and the work becomes very, very difficult. Now, very dangerous, hazardous assignments or, posting women in unsafe places, organizations are a little reluctant to do that, partly based on stereotypes, partly based on reality as well. Now, there can be another category of stereotypes which can be dangerous, and that is that of minority communities. So, when we look at minorities, any kind of minorities, whether they are ethnic minorities or religious minorities, we ascribe several attributes to the community, but we don't take the pain of judging a particular individual. Now, the question is, why do we rely on stereotypes? We rely on stereotypes because people tend to do as little cognitive work as possible when it comes to thinking about others. We want to form quick judgments, and stereotype gives us that shortcuts. Now, what can be the dangers of stereotypes in organizations? It affects and impairs the social perception process. It makes it faulty. It makes fundamental culture change difficult. Now, to give an example, GE had a set of institutionalized beliefs about the customer, government stakeholders, etc., which had caused a lot of problems. Now, so when you stereotype someone or somebody, then there is a great chance that you are forming an inaccurate judgment of them. So, stereotyping is the first and most commonly prevalent perceptual bias that you will come across. What is the next? The next is the halo effect. Now, what is the meaning of the halo? Halo is the ball of light that shines around the heads of saints. So, how does it come down to becoming a perceptual bias? What does it mean? The tendency for our overall impression of others to affect objective evaluations of their specific traits, perceiving high correlations between characteristics that may be unrelated. So basically, if we decode all of this into more simplistic terms, it is often described, halo effect is often described as the process in which we perceive a person as being very good or being very excellent based on a single positive characteristic. So, for example, if there is a student who comes to the class on time regularly, I have 20 classes and I have never found this student defaulting in any single class on the basis of time, very punctual student. So, does that mean that the student is also academically very brilliant? If I make this connection without any evidence to the matter, then I fall a victim to the halo effect. Now, halo is often described as the performance appraisal when a rater makes the error of judging a person's personality or performance on the basis of a single positive trait, which is what I mentioned. Now, there is an opposite to the halo effect also, and that has a very interesting name, which is called as the Horn effect, where a person is downgraded because of a single negative characteristic or incident. Now, all of these can happen in organizations, and they do happen. Now, for example, if I say that a person, a child, let us take the example of a child. Child is very, very well behaved child, very respectful to elders, etc. That is a positive characteristic, but that doesn't mean that that will lead to academic brilliance within the child. So if I connect the two in my mind without any evidence to the matter, then I fall a victim to the halo effect. Now, what are the general halo characteristics? It's a common rater error. It has both true and illusory components. It has affected general evaluation and it can have very negative consequences in organizations. Now, if I give a pictorial description of the halo, so this is how it is. Characteristic 1 is high, positive. So that will lead to characteristic 2 and 3 automatically becoming positive. And then the more favorable someone is perceived on some characteristics, the more likely that he or she will be perceived favorably on other characteristics too, which he or she may not have. So you are ascribing qualities to a person that he or she may not have based on a single positive characteristic. So this is halo for you. Now moving on, there's something called as selective perception. People selectively interpret what they see on the basis of their interests, backgrounds, experiences, and attitudes. Sometimes we don't bother with the total picture or connecting the dots, as the famous line goes, but we are only interested in seeing what we want to see. So that is called as selective perception. Then there is something called as contrast effect. Now, what does it mean? Evaluation of a person's characteristics that are affected by comparisons with other people recently encountered who rank higher or lower on the same characteristics. Now, to give you an example of this, let us say, as an evaluator, I am evaluating certain answer scripts. When I've started my evaluation, I evaluate very, very poorly written answer scripts. And after evaluating 5 or 6 such answer scripts, I come across an averagely written answer script. Mind you, it's not a very well written answer script, but it's far better than the ones that I have just evaluated. In my mind, I ascribe a lot more value to this average answer script than I should. Why? Because I compare it with the very, very poorly written answer scripts that I had already evaluated. Now, reverse is also true. Let us say, as a teacher, I evaluate very, very good answer scripts. So when I come across an average answer script, I downgrade it to what I should not be doing, because once again, it is compared to the ones which have preceded it. So after poorly written answer scripts, there is a tendency in my mind to give a lot more marks to the averagely written answer script than I should, because of this contrast comparison. So that's how the contrast effect can work negatively in organizations. It can happen in a recruiting situation as well. So if the candidates before you were not really good, then even your average performance has the capacity to impress. But if the candidates preceding you were really, really good, even your good performance may not really impress the recruiters. So that's the meaning of the contrast. Now, moving ahead, we have a very interesting category of perceptual bias or error, which is called as the expectancy or the self-fulfilling prophecy. What is the meaning of this? It's the tendency for someone's expectations about another to cause that person to behave in a manner which is consistent with those expectations. Now, these self-fulfilling prophecies can be positive, they can also be negative. Now, the positive impact is called as the Pygmalion effect. What is it? That when you have high expectations of another, then you tend to pull in your best resources. That means you would want to provide the best resources to those individuals. And there is a 100% chance that they may also produce good outcomes. So to give you an example of this, let us say I have very great expectations out of my students. I know that, or I perceive them to be academically brilliant. What will I do? I will give them the best possible resources which are at my disposal. And there is a 90% chance that they may come back with good results. Now, this is called as the Pygmalion effect. And there have been many examples, including that of Continental Airlines in 1995 and its then CEO, Gordon Bethune, who came out with the slogan from worst to first and turned around Continental's fate from being a bankrupt company to going back into a very, very profitable and people-centric company. Now, we need to understand that the self-fulfilling prophecies they had been researched heavily in the most what should I say, deadly intelligence agencies in the world, which is, of course, Mossad in Israel. So when you look at the Israeli soldiers, they are highly disciplined, they're very competent, and they have the best resources at their disposal. So these studies started with an experiment on Israeli soldiers taking a combat command course. Now, as I said, self-fulfilling prophecies have positive and negative effects. The positive is the Pygmalion, but there is a negative impact also, which is the golem. Now, if you have any low expectations of someone, you will not try to waste your time there. You will not give your best there. And there is a 90% possibility that that person will come back to you with poor results. So, for example, let us say, for whatever reasons, I think that I don't have very great quality students. So, I'm not inclined to waste my time, energy, and resources there. So, maybe I will give very, very perfunctory resources there, and there is a 90% chance that they may not be able to succeed. So, these are called as the expectancy errors or the self fulfilling prophecies. Now, if you look at influences in organizations, how do these influences matter? And where do they happen? Why are these biases dangerous? The first is employment interviews. Perceptual biases of raters affect the accuracy of interviewers' judgments of applicants because you form perception in a single glance that may be 1/10 of a second. Now, for performance expectations, self-fulfilling prophecy or the Pygmalion effect, the lower or higher performance of employees reflects preconceived leader expectations about employee capabilities. Then comes performance evaluations. Appraisals are often the subjective judgmental perception of appraisers of another employee's job performance, and it can have a critical impact on employees. For example, if you enter into selective perception, then when you are evaluating your employees, you will only look at those things that matter to you, but not the person as a whole. So your ratings can be biased, they can be highly judgmental, and they may have a negative impact on the entire team. Now, on the other hand, when you look at performance expectations, particularly the Pygmalion and the golem effect, they may be great. Pygmalion may be positive, but can have a negative impact also. And this is to be seen in the growing number of suicides among the youth, particularly the brilliant youth who are in our premier colleges and institutions. When we have very, very high expectations of them and they are unable to meet those expectations, what can be the consequences? So these are some negative impacts which might happen because of perceptual biases and errors. So if I look at a recap of today's class, what all things have we done? We've looked at social perception, the understanding of social perception, how the perceiver and the perceived can affect the process of social perception. And because it is social perception, it is necessarily flawed. There are a lot of biases and errors that people may enter into while forming a perception of another. So we've looked at them, and what are they? They are basically many. Now, we look at the stereotyping, we look at the halo effect, we look at so many other errors like the selective perception, the contrast, and we look at the expectancy errors in the self-fulfilling prophecies. So today's entire session has been focused on social perception, and I thank you for this attention.